Welcome to KU Padasala. My name is Chad Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America, and I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to discuss with you the very important topic of German for reading knowledge. In this sixth lesson, we will move on to another case. Now, you might remember from the earlier lessons that case is the phenomenon whereby the role of a noun within a sentence can be communicated through a change to the form either of the noun itself, or more so in German, a change to the word which precedes it, which is either the definite article the, or some other words, which we will get to a little later, but for the moment, let's just think of it as a change to the word the. Well, we already covered the subjective case, which is called in more technical terms the nominative case, and the direct object case, which is the accusative. So now that we've covered subject and object, you might wonder, what else could there possibly be? Haven't we covered all of the possibilities? After all, in English, we have I and me as seemingly the only two options here. You have he and him, they and them, seems to cover everything. Well, the other option really, I think, has to do with a certain ambiguity with regard to the word object itself. Just consider the following sentence in English. The boy gives the girl the flower. Well, it's obvious in this sentence that the boy is the subject, he's the one doing the giving, but there seem to be two objects here. The boy gives the girl the flower. Well, the girl seems to be the object, she's not the one doing the giving here, but the flower also seems to be an object. Now, we would normally clarify this by rearranging the words to add a preposition before the girl to show more clearly that she's the indirect object. We might say, with a different word order, the boy gives the flower to the girl, but we also have the option in English of using the other word order in which to is deleted as what linguists call a redundancy. Well, this sort of ambiguity would not even be possible within a language like German, because it is not the position within the sentence which tells you whether the noun or pronoun is acting as subject or object. It's rather the form itself, in which it's not just the one objective form in English, which in the case of the pronoun her, it would be her whether she was the direct object or the indirect object. If I refer to the girl with the pronoun, which does have something like a case form, the subjective is she. Well, we know the objective form is her. Well, even if I treat her as the direct object, I contacted her, or I called her, or I saw her when she was walking on the street. That's direct. But if I gave something to her, it's still the form her. So we have this ambiguity, which is only really resolved in English by adding in that preposition, but in German that's not even a problem because there's two different forms of object, which we can classify now as the difference between the accusative and the dative. Now, the dative is arguably related to the Latin word for giving, which is why this is the best example, because if you want to know what data are the things that are givens, things given to the five-sentence, things you can actually directly observe through seeing them, touching them, smelling them, etc. So this givenness is, I think, related to the etymology of talking about it as the dative case. But be that as it may, we have this idea that in the morphology of the determiners or definite articles themselves, we will see a much greater change in the dative case than we had seen in the accusative. In the accusative, the only determiner or article which actually looked different from the nominative was the masculine. You might remember masculine changed from der with an R to den with an N, whereas for feminine, neuter, and plural, it just stayed D, das, and D. Well, in dative, we will see different forms for all four columns of that row. For the singular masculine, the dative is dem with an M, which is very similar, if you really think about it, to the shift from he to him with that M at the end. So that is the masculine form, dem. Then we have the feminine dative form, der. Now, be careful here. That also looks like the nominative masculine. It's spelled D-E-R. So you have to pay attention to context to determine whether you're dealing with a masculine noun in the nominative or with a feminine noun in the dative. The neuter form is dem. There is overlap between the masculine and the neuter in this particular case, even if there is not in the first two. And then for the plural, we have den. Now, once again, we have to be careful here because den was already thought to be the accusative masculine singular determiner. We shifted from der to den. Well, here we're also shifting to den, but context will tell you whether you're dealing with that or whether you're dealing with the plural. Another change is that some nouns will also take on an additional n at the end of them when they are in the dative plural case, although some nouns already have an n at the end because they have that as their pluralizing form. Of course, pluralization, we will see a little bit later, is very irregular within German in that many different verbs have many different pluralization forms. But for the moment, we'll take into consideration that in some cases, when it is put into the dative plural form, you will have den as the determiner and you will have an n added onto the noun itself. Now, the dative case is something which is very well exemplified through the image of somebody giving something to somebody else. But it applies to a lot more than just that. There's a whole class of so-called dative verbs, which are a little bit tricky because in the English translation, we treat oftentimes the object of them as a direct object. We don't even use the preposition to because it doesn't seem necessary. But if you really think about the meaning of these verbs, you realize that there is something of an indirect relation which is presupposed in them. For example, there is the verb of helfen, or to help. Well, in English, you say, I help the director, but what you're really saying, I think, is that I'm giving my help to that person. And this is reflected in the German, ich helfe dem Regisseur. Similarly, thanking is treated in English as a direct object oriented verb, but in German we can see more clearly the indirect nature of it because it's really more like I'm giving my thanks to the professor. There's some old hymns in the English language, for example, which talk about giving thanks to God. Well, that's really what you're doing. So in German it would be wir danken der Professorin rather than we thank the professor. Now, once again, the first time you see that, you might think to yourself that der Professorin is trying to treat the female professor, we know through the in ending, as something masculine because it's like, no, it's not der, it's die. Well, be careful. Der is the nominative singular masculine, but it is also the dative singular feminine. This is why context will tell you which of those it is. Similarly, we say we believe the reports, treating it as a direct object, but it's really more like we put our faith in the reports, and that's why it is indirect. In German, as wir glauben den Berichten. Final example on this slide, die Bücher gehören der Universität. Here we have the idea that if something belongs to something else, even in English we use the preposition to because we have an understanding that that belonging to is inherently an indirect relation rather than the kind of excessively direct relation you would have with an accusative object. Now, we also have the tendency for words that look like der to take on the case forms when they are put into the dative, which reflect the column of the masculine singular. You might remember that the question word for who, wer, W-E-R, looks a lot like the word for the for masculine singular, which is der. So when this is put into the direct object whom, it changes from der to den. What if you're asking the question, to whom? What if you have the example of a director explaining a text to an actor? Der Regisseur erklärt dem Schauspieler den Text. So here we understand that the text is the thing being explained as the direct object because it's den Text with an N in the accusative case, but the text is the thing being explained to the actor who's supposed to perform this role correctly, and that's why it's dem Schauspieler with the M at the end of the determinant. But if we want to ask the question, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you, to whom is he explaining it, or simply to whom, we would say them, W-E-M, in much the same way that if that were accusative, we would say then, or W-E-N. And in answer to them, to whom, one would simply answer dem Schauspieler, also in the dative case. You could also say, as a final example here, wir zeigten den Besuchern das Parlament. So here we have two different objects. The direct object is das Parlament. Remember, the neuter, nominative, and accusative forms both look the same, das and das, as regards the article. But here we realize that we're dealing with den Besucher not as a direct object in the accusative case of the masculine, singular. Rather, we're dealing with a plural dative object, which is the visitors themselves. Wir zeigen den Besuchern das Parlament. But as though it weren't enough work to learn the dative case, we have yet another case in German that we're going to learn in this lesson itself. And this is the genitive case. Now, the first time you hear that, you might think to yourself, but what else could there possibly be? We have the subject with the nominative case, the accusative with the dative case, and we have the direct object with the accusative case, and we have the indirect object with the dative case. So what other sort of object could there be? Well, there's also a certain implicit object of possession, but one which does not explicitly require the presence of a verb. You could say, for example, that my father has a nice house, or you could simply talk about the nice house of my father, or even more informal terms, my father's nice house. Now, if you look very closely at what I just did, even in the English language, I added an S to the word father to show that possession, which at first glance might seem to be the kind of contraction you would have between a noun and a verb, such as is. In fact, if I were to speak informally about what my father is doing, I would do exactly that. I would say, well, my father's reading the paper. That's a contraction between father and is. But in talking about my father's house, I'm really not doing that. Rather, I have a contraction in which it's not two words, rather it's an ending added onto the same word, which shows that it's been put into the genitive or the possessive case. This is one of the very rare examples in English where you do still have a morphological change for case applied to something other than a personal pronoun. Well, very similarly in German, you have what might be called that genitive S, which shows possession not in all genders, but specifically when you're dealing with masculine and neuter, which shows it through that S. Now, before we examine the change to the noun, we'll take a look at the change to the definite article. For the singular masculine genitive, we have the determiner change to des. So we have the R ending for the nominative, the N ending for the accusative, the M ending for the dative, and the S ending now for the genitive. In the feminine, we have der, which looks the same as the dative. Once again, context will determine which one of those you're dealing with. While for the neuter, it looks very similar to the masculine. There's a lot of overlap between those two in the bottom two rows of this table. We have des also for the neuter, and for the plural we have der, which looks like the feminine genitive, but also like the feminine dative, and also like the nominative masculine. All right, so now we can resume the discussion of how exactly it is that you use the genitive now that we've established the morphology of the genitive case. Well, the genitive case typically denotes possession, although in addition to that it is used with certain prepositions, as we will learn later on when we deal with prepositions, but typically you can translate it as a prepositional phrase within English along the lines of the such and such. For example, the German phrase der Name des Künstlers could be translated as the name of the artist, although it is more natural to just say the artist's name, to put artist itself into the genitive case within English. Similarly, das Werkzeug des Arbeiters is the worker's tools, or the tools of the worker. Die Bewegung der Erde is the movement of the earth, or the earth's movement. Das Jahr der Frau is the year of the woman, while die Farbe des Hauses is the house's color. Now notice what I just did. There is an implicit S added onto house that is not added onto Frau. The reason for that is that house is in the neuter case, therefore it becomes des Hauses, while the neuter gender, while because Frau is feminine, it remains just der Frau without an ending to the noun itself. Similarly, der Einfluss der Kirche is the influence of the church. Die Meinung der Leute is the opinion of the people. Die Stimme des Volkes is the voice of the people. Well, now that we've covered the four cases of German, we can try to clarify a bit more how the personal pronouns in German might undergo changes like the ones we already know within the English language. I mentioned very early on that personal pronouns are among the only class of words which, in the English language, which reliably have a morphological change to indicate whether they are subjective, objective, etc. Well, now we can examine the case forms of the personal pronouns, starting with ich. Now, ich is the singular nominative first person, or the word we already know as I. Mich, however, is the accusative version of that, which we would translate as me, while mich is basically the translation to me within the dative case. Similarly, the second person, singular informal, in the nominative case is du or you, which becomes dich in the accusative and dir in the dative. Is he, or in some contexts it, if you are referring to an inanimate object that is within the masculine gender within German, but is considered to be inanimate within English. That's how you would translate it. So is nominative, but ihn is him or it within the accusative. Now you may have noticed that just as den is the accusative marker within the masculine column, so too for him we have ihn indicating that it is accusative, while im with an m, I-H-M, indicates that it is dative. This is the actual cognate of the English word him. So if we were to be more faithful to the Germanic roots, we would have another English pronoun for the accusative case called not him, but hin. But of course, that is something which is very unlikely to happen. So in addition to he, we also have she, which in the nominative is sie. But in the accusative, it's actually the same form, sie. So sie, you have to be very careful, can either be she or her, either subjective or object. Context will tell you. But in the dative case, she becomes her, or to her, which becomes ich, which does look a lot like the English word her. Es or it also has the same form in the accusative as it does in the nominative. That is also just es, but that becomes im in the dative, overlapping with the masculine in a way we have already gotten used to. The plural wir is very similar to the English word we, the plural first person, and it becomes uns in both the accusative and the dative. Ihr is you plural in the nominative. It becomes euch for both the accusative and the dative, while sie is the nominative and accusative form for they and them, while it becomes ihnen in the dative. Sie is also, of course, you formal, but we know that this is different from they in the sense that it is capitalized while they is lowercase s. This has the same forms of sie for the nominative, sie for the accusative, and ihnen for the dative.